Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the New York Times and its climb down over Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. paper says its journalists should be more skeptical. Tweet dreams are made of this. The social networking tool, Twitter, grows at an exponential rate.
Ryan from Toronto is watching our show right now. He just sent us this tweet.
But is it good for the media? The Somali radio station that has suffered its third murder this year, and the flash mob that hammered Los Angeles. Regular viewers of The Listening Post might get the feeling that we have a thing about the New York Times, since we've done multiple stories on the newspaper. But that's not the case. It's just that when the most influential paper in America, and possibly the world, gets important stories wrong, particularly stories on issues like torture and Guantanamo Bay, we're going to cover their coverage. There's a big debate in the U.S. media over what to do about Guantanamo and the prisoners there once the facility is closed. Recently, the New York Times had a front-page story leaked from the Pentagon that said 1 in 7 prisoners released from Guantanamo had already returned to terrorism. The trouble was, the figure wasn't true, the story should not have run, and given its well-publicized failings over its reportings on security issues over the past few years, the Times should have known better. That's our starting point this week, the paper that promises all the news that's fit to print, and the media war over Guantanamo Bay.
The problems are pretty much right there in the headline. 1 in 7 detainees rejoined jihad, Pentagon finds.
The problem with this story was that it was just flatly inaccurate.
This really was nothing more than Pentagon propaganda, and it made it onto the front page of one of the most respected newspapers in the United States.
And it did not stop there.
You've got the lead story, Elizabeth, today in the Times, where you point out that in an unreleased Pentagon report, 1 in 7 detainees who are released returned to jihad.
Like most news reports, it replicated.
An unreleased Pentagon report concludes that 1 in 7 Gitmo detainees released from the facility has returned to terrorism. Now, according to the New York Times, the full report has not been released.
And spread like a virus.
14% of the detainees released under President Bush, that's 74 out of 540, returned to terrorism.
That rate has been slowly but steadily rising, and Pentagon officials expect it to go still higher by the time Guantanamo is closed.
The story was broken by the New York Times on May 21st, in the midst of a huge political debate in the United States over the future of Guantanamo Bay and the prisoners held there. The byline belonged to the paper's Pentagon correspondent, Elizabeth Boomiller, and her report immediately came under criticism.
Well, let's start with the 1 in 7.
Clearly, by stating that prisoners have returned to the battlefield, it suggests that they were on the battlefield in the first place. And as we know, the majority of the Guantanamo prisoners weren't captured on the battlefield.
And therefore, whether or not they could re-engage in terrorism is an open question.
And what does re-engaging in terrorism, or as the Times put it, rejoining the jihad, actually mean?
Some of the best work on this has been done by Mark Denbo at Seton Hall, and his research has shown that, for example, the Pentagon has classified as acts of terrorism engaged in by freed prisoners such things as writing an op-ed for the New York Times or appearing in a film about Guantanamo.
Returning to the battlefield includes speaking out in the media about the treatment that was received. So the Tipton Three, who are 3 guys who were involved in a film about their experiences, The Road to Guantanamo, have at some point or other counted as being recidivists who've returned to terrorist activities. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary.
Then there was the timing of the story. The Pentagon dated its report April 7th. The Times piece did not come out until 6 weeks later.
So the Pentagon had the report out for a month and a half, showing it to no one, and then suddenly they decided to show it to the New York Times.
And the Times published it the same day that President Obama made a major speech about Guantanamo.
We are closing the prison at Guantanamo.
But it wasn't the only speech covered that day. There was another one by an architect of the Bush administration's policy on Guantanamo, the former vice president, Dick Cheney.
Keep in mind that these are hardened terrorists picked up overseas since 9/11.
And he is talking about the very same report and using it to make the point that he has been trying to make for weeks now, which is that Obama's approach to national security is a disaster, and that example one is that closing Guantanamo is going to bring all kinds of terrorism into the world.
An estimated 14% of those released previously are believed to be back in the business of jihad.
If any of this sounds familiar, it should. Back in 2002, the Bush administration used the New York Times to help sell a war. On one occasion, it leaked a false story to the Times about Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, and then Vice President Cheney quoted the Times on the air to make the case for invading Iraq.
There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources.
2 years after that, the Times admitted its journalistic failings in the run-up to the war, in an editorial that said its reporting lacked rigor, was insufficiently challenging, and should have been more aggressive. The Times' public editor, Clark Hoyt, has now issued a similar mea culpa on the Guantanamo story, saying the reporter and editors were not nearly skeptical enough. He called the article seriously flawed, greatly overplayed, and he even raised the I word, Iraq.
I think it's important, too, that the New York Times public editor suggested that the New York Times coverage of this story ought to be compared to the New York Times failures to adequately report skeptically the problems leading up to the Iraq War.
He actually linked it to the New York Times' coverage in the run-up to the Iraq War and said, you know, look, the problem there was a failure to be skeptical, and here is this same problem again. So it was actually an unusually strong response from the Times' public editor.
They're never going to be able to completely set the record straight, of course, because that talking point, that headline of 1 in 7 returns to terrorism is now part of the political debate. And of course, that's something that's troubling.
The New York Times is still capable of and produces some of the finest reporting that journalism has to offer. But the next time the paper wants to report on repeat offenders involved in the so-called war on terror, it might want to look closer to home. It could do a story on itself. Here's how our Global Village voices see the reporting of the Guantanamo story by the New York Times.
First of all, I think it's commendable that the New York Times admitted that whatever flaws it might have had in its coverage, I just think that they need to be maybe more thorough in inspecting their sources and getting other opinions from the people.
They need a little bit more time to investigate the quality and accuracy of what they're provided with, because this, whatever they normally write, has the potential to change people's lives.
The New York Times being less than thorough, it's like, I think it's a travesty. That's a shame. When it's like the New York Times is supposed to be like an institution. You know, usually whatever the New York Times says, you would take it as solid gold.
Email, Facebook, or Twitter. You can use any of those three if you'd like to become one of our Global Village voices. Our email address is listeningpost@aljazeera.net. You can also find the Listening Post page on Facebook, or you can use Twitter or Facebook to see ahead of time what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program. And please keep your ideas coming for stories and internet videos of the week. We'll get our News Bite section started with an important development in a story that we led with last week, the use of torture by the U.S. military and the suppression of pictures. Last week, we told you about a piece of legislation in the U.S. known as the Graham-Lieberman Photo Suppression Amendment. If passed by the U.S. Congress, the amendment would have given the Pentagon the power to block the release of any photograph taken of prisoners between 9/11 and the end of the Bush administration if the U.S. military thought such an image would cause anger and put U.S. forces at risk. The amendment, which was part of a larger military spending bill, was dropped when opposition to the amendment threatened the passage of the entire bill. Bloggers and activists who bombarded their congressional representatives with their complaints about the proposed law are celebrating a victory, but they do fear that it may be temporary since there are other efforts underway to block the publication of images and documents relating to the treatment of foreign prisoners in U.S.-controlled jails. Computer manufacturers in China have been warned. Starting next month, if they want to sell PCs in the country, they'll have to install blocking software first. The blocking software is ostensibly aimed at stopping web surfers getting access to online pornography. However, it can also be used to block politically sensitive websites. China's internet police, who number in the tens of thousands, routinely block access to sites advocating Tibetan independence or promoting the Falun Gong spiritual movement. More recently, China blocked access to Twitter and other sites in the run-up to the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square uprising and subsequent crackdown. Somalia, one of the most dangerous countries in the world to report from, has seen the killing of yet another journalist, the fifth this year. Mokhtar Mohammed Hirabe, the director of the influential Radio Shabelle, was shot dead in the capital, Mogadishu. A journalist colleague accompanying him, Ahmed Omar Hashi, was also shot several times and is receiving treatment in hospital. Hirabe is the third Radio Shabelle journalist killed in the last 5 months. He was murdered in a part of Mogadishu controlled by the Islamist al-Shabaab militia. Amnesty International has concluded the killing of journalists in Somalia is not simply a caught in the crossfire issue, but a deliberate attempt to stem the flow of information out of the country. When Argentina's President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner canceled the tax debts of 5 media companies recently, it looked like an official act of generosity, especially considering that some of those media outlets have been critical of her. Turns out, though, there was a quid pro quo. The media firms will repay those debts with advertisements that will make the Kirchner government look good. Ms. Fernández de Kirchner, who succeeded her husband as president, has little time for the media. Her husband had even less. He didn't hold a single news conference in his 4 years in office. The Kirchners prefer to get their message out through ads. The government will spend $125 million on them this year. That's more than 8 times as much as Mr. Kirchner's government spent in his first year in office in 2003. We're back after the break with a report on the social networking phenomenon known as Twitter.